How's it going, everybody? It's Rutech. Today we're talking about an insane $1,100 4K gaming PC. Alright, let's first get started by taking a look at our motherboard, the ASRock B650 PG Lightning. This is a higher end build which you might want to overclock down the line, so this board was an obvious choice to me. You'll also find that it has 3 different M2 SSD slots, meaning that upgrading your storage down the line will be no problem at all. It's also super decked out on the rear I/O as it has 1 USB 2.0 port, 5 USB 3.0 ports, an HDMI port, audio connectors, a USB-C port, and a BIOS flashback button. Anyway, for the next set of steps, you'll want to have the motherboard on top of the box it came in. This is just rule of thumb to prevent any problems with static discharge. Aside from the motherboard, in the box you'll also find an instruction booklet, SATA cables, which we won't be using, and M2 screws. Now let's check out the RAM, which is Team Group's T-Create Expert 6000 MHz CL30 memory. I've always been a huge fan of Team Group RAM as it's super reliable and usually is pretty sexy looking, and this kit is no exception. As you probably saw in the intro cinematic, it looks phenomenal in this build. But anyway, this is 32 GB, which is more than enough. For storage, I chose the crucial P3. Now, truth be told, you don't have to get this exact M2 SSD. You can get one with more capacity, one that's cheaper. Maybe you want to get the P3 Plus, which is a little bit faster than this one. Either way, they all install the exact same. In the box, of course, is the SSD and an included M2 screw, but we won't need to use it because the motherboard fastens it using the heatsink. Next up, one of my all-time favorite CPUs out there, the Ryzen 5 7600. It's a 6-core, 12-threaded monster. It's a great choice as a processor for not just gaming, but also productivity tasks. I would also argue that it's pretty future-proof because it has DDR5 support, PCIe 5 support, and has really strong single-core performance. When removing this processor from its plastic case, you certainly want to be careful because it's pretty easy to drop, and I've totally never done that before. Now let's direct our attention to the power supply, the EVGA 650 BP. This may be a smaller form factor power supply, but ironically it's cheaper than its ATX equivalent. Anyway, this particular supply has 600 watts of 80 plus bronze certified power, and this PC overall is expected to only have a drawn power of 421 watts. Since it's an 80 plus bronze certified supply, 80% of 600 is 520, meaning you have roughly 100 watts of wiggle room for future upgrades. I also want to mention that EVGA is easily my favorite power supply company, as in my experience they tend to be the most reliable. Next up, a part you've definitely been interested to hear about, the graphics card. For this build, I chose the Asus Dual AMD RX 7700 XT with 12 GB of VRAM. It's built on the RDNA 3 architecture, and to put it simply, it can run any game at 1440p. It can also run a lot of games at 4K, as long as you adjust some of the settings. But some games you can just straight up run at 4K in ultra settings with 0 upscaling. Examples being Call of Duty Modern Warfare 3, Warzone 2, and Formula 1 2023. Next up is the case. This is one I've always wanted to do a build in, and the time has finally come. This is the Magnum Air Neo Air 2. This case is awesome for a good couple of reasons. First and foremost, it looks pretty sweet. That wood on the front is not real, it is plastic, but that's honestly to be expected. The Neo Air 2 also has incredible airflow and comes with 4 included 120mm fans. It is also a pretty spacious case, so cable management won't become a headache. As for the CPU cooler, I went with Arctic's Freezer 34 Esports Duo. I really appreciate Arctic for sending out this cooler, because not only is it the perfect cooler for the aesthetic of this build, but it's also a truly powerful cooler. Now, CPU coolers tend to be one of the harder parts to install, but I will say this Arctic cooler in particular was quite easy, and I was pleasantly surprised. And you'll see what I'm talking about later in the video during the tutorial segment. Now let's check out the cable extenders. These are the black and white cable extenders from Flex, and they are purely an aesthetic decision. You technically don't need to buy these for the computer to work. Instead, you would just be using the power supply cables, as these are only extenders. Let's kick off this build tutorial with a satisfying plastic peel. Super nice. So our first step is to unhinge the CPU bracket like so. And that's all it takes to prep the motherboard for the processor. Take it out of its plastic casing, and then gently place it into its socket with the golden arrow matching up with the silver arrow on the plate. Now you can clamp this bracket back down and lower the lever back into its original position. Next up, let's install that RAM. You have to make sure it's these two slots. It can't be the other two or else the RAM won't function properly. The best way to install RAM is to gently place it into the slot and then click it down using your thumbs. Next, we'll install the storage. You will need a pretty small Phillips head screwdriver for this. Loosen these two screws right here and then remove the heatsink. Then in this exact orientation, slide the SSD into this slot. Before you reinstall the heatsink, you have to make sure you take off this protective plastic film off of the bottom, otherwise the SSD won't properly dissipate its heat into the heatsink. And now you just simply reinstall it as it was. And just like that, we already have the CPU, the RAM, and the storage installed. Next up is, in my opinion, the hardest step of every PC build, installing the CPU cooler, at least if it's an aftermarket cooler. You'll find these two black brackets on either side of the CPU, and you'll want to remove those. We'll also need to remove the fans from the CPU cooler heatsink. This is because we'll be fastening screws that the fans get in the way of. To do so, all you need to do is loosen and remove these metal brackets. Don't worry, they reinstall pretty easily. Now it's time to install some metal hardware onto the CPU cooler, starting with this metal bracket. Do make sure it's in this exact orientation. Once you have these two pieces set, you'll use these screws, which came with the CPU cooler, to fasten them on. Now, coming out of this bag, which came with the CPU cooler as well, you'll be installing these pieces onto the motherboard. Notice how they only have one notch. The side with the notch should be facing downwards, and these you can just hand tighten onto the board. Another awesome thing about this cooler, it comes with thermal paste. You'll want to put about a pea-sized equivalent right in the middle of the CPU. Now, in this orientation with the Arctic logo facing right side up, you'll want to install the CPU cooler heatsink. It should align perfectly with those screw mounts we installed. With that in place, it's time to fasten the heatsink using these screws. Now, there is a special particular way to do this. You'll want to fasten each corner a little bit at a time. This ensures that the thermal paste we installed is getting evenly distributed on the CPU heat spreader. Now to show how to reinstall those fans, I'm going to do it off of the motherboard, but you're going to be doing this with the cooler on the motherboard. It was just easier to film and demonstrate it this way. As you can see, what I like to do is put the bracket into the heatsink first, and then fold it over so it attaches to the fan. And you'll of course want to repeat that step for the other three. And it's very important that you install the fans facing the same direction, meaning one's pulling in air, one's pushing out air. The other fan will go on this way. Once those fans are reinstalled, you'll want to plug them into this header labeled CPU Fan 1. This is on the top side of the motherboard. Now it's time to start installing things into the case, so let's take off all of these side panels. You'll find this little box on the bottom side of the case. This is really important as it has many screws that we'll be using throughout the build. After that box has been violently discarded, it's time to install the power supply. Make sure that when you install this, the fan is facing downwards. Otherwise, you risk getting that power supply real hot, real fast. To fasten it, you use the 4 screws that were included in the power supply box. And now we can finally install the completed motherboard into the case. Best way to do this, align the I/O cutout with the I/O shield. Now that the motherboard is aligned with the standoffs, you can fasten it to the case using these screws. With the motherboard and power supply installed into the case, all we have left is wiring everything up and installing the graphics card. Now if you decided to get those cool looking cable extenders, now is the time to attach them. Get your 24-pin power cable coming out of the power supply and connect it to the female end of the 24-pin cable extender. We're going to do the same exact thing with the CPU power cable. Comes out of the power supply and we attach it to the female end of the extender. The PCIe power cable, which of course also is coming out of the power supply, will get two extenders attached to it, as you'll see here. The PCI power cable splits off into two different male connectors, both of which will get plugged into the graphics card later on. That does it for the cable extenders. Now let's start plugging things in. 24-pin cable goes through this top middle cutout. And then you plug it into this big connector, which is to the right of the RAM. Next up, the CPU power cable. This goes through this top right cutout. And side note, if you're having a hard time differentiating this from the PCIe power cable, the CPU power cable splits off into two 2x2 power connectors, whereas the PCIe one does a 2x3 and a 1x2. Next up are the front panel cables. These are coming out of the front of the case, as you can see. This blue one is USB 3.0 and it'll go through this middle cutout right here. It'll then get plugged into this connector, which is right below the 24-pin power connector. After that, also coming out of the front panel is the audio cable. We're going to route this through the bottom right cutout. It'll then get plugged into this connector, which is on the very bottom left of the motherboard. Next is the power switch cable. In a lot of other cases, you'll find that this cable is split into 4 or 5 different ones. Luckily, it's all in one with this case. And it'll get plugged into this connector, which is on the very bottom right of the motherboard. Now we're going to prep the case for the installation of the graphics card. Start off by removing these two screws and then removing the bracket. Then you'll want to remove the second to the top and third to the top PCIe slot cover. And two big things before installing the graphics card: remove that protective plastic and push down the PCIe retention tab. Align that graphics card with its slot and then push it in. You might hear a little click coming from the retention tab. Then, using those screws you just removed, fasten the graphics card to the case. Notice how I'm giving a little bit of upward support to the graphics card using my other hand. And then for good measure, of course, reinstall that second screw. With the graphics card installed, we can reinstall that plate from earlier. And the final step of this build, plug those PCIe power cables into the graphics card. If you're having a hard time with this step, do make sure that the 1x2 gets plugged in before the 2x3, or just make sure that the connectors are side by side before you plug it in. And now the PC is officially built. Let's move on to the next step, which is installing Windows and drivers. Installing Windows is super easy, and I actually just uploaded a short video on how exactly to do it. You can find the link to it in the description. Additionally, links to all drivers I recommend that you get for this PC will also be in the description. And now, last but certainly not least, it's time for benchmarks. For all of these benchmarks, I did the lowest settings of 1440p, highest settings of 1440p, lowest settings of 4K, and then highest settings of 4K. That way, you'll know the full range of what the PC can output in both resolutions. Alrighty, music time. I'll see you guys in the outro. This was a really fun PC to build, and I'm sure whoever of you guys decide to build it will also have an absolute blast. And the final product looks really nice too, so all your hard work will pay off. But yeah, that will wrap up today's tutorial. If you enjoyed the video, drop a like, have any comments or questions, please do leave a comment or join my Discord. I will do my absolute best to answer you. I don't want to leave any of you guys hanging. And of course, if you enjoy the content you're seeing, I would really appreciate a sub. Thanks for watching. Peace out.